Good morning, and thank you for joining us at the PIA Law-sponsored Medical Marijuana, What Healthcare Practitioners Need to Know webinar. We're here to provide an overview of not only the medical but legal landscape of medical marijuana in the province of Ontario and more generally across Canada. We have some excellent speakers here today. Beside me is Michael Warfe of McLeish, Orlando, and beside him is Eden Dales, a social worker. Beside Ms. Dales is Dr. Tanny of Apollo Medical Clinics, and beside her is Stacey Stevens, a partner at Thomson Rogers. My name is Kevin Henderson. I'm going to be chairing the discussion today. I'm a partner at Oatley, Vigmond. In terms of housekeeping, there's just a few things. You'll have an opportunity on your screen to ask questions, and I would encourage you to submit questions for the question and answer period. There's going to be approximately 45 minutes of talks, followed by 45 minutes for question and answer. Also, all of the slides that you see before you in the presentation will be available after the webinar, and if you feel the need to obtain the slides, if you're not watching this live, you can obtain it by way of emailing each of the presenters individually. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael Warfe. Michael is an associate lawyer at McLeish, Orlando, with a Bachelor of Science and Master in Neuroscience, and he's appeared at all levels of court in Ontario and has even appeared at the Supreme Court of Canada in 2014. In Michael's practice, he only represents plaintiffs that have been seriously injured in all variety of accidents, and his goal is always to ensure they receive maximum compensation for their injuries. Michael?
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone, for logging in today for the presentations. I'm going to start today by just getting us situated in terms of the framework around marijuana legislation. And perhaps the best way to do that is to start with kind of where it all began to understand how we got to today. Prior to 1923, marijuana was not illegal. Opium was. But then in 1922, the first female judge in the British Empire at that time, Emily Murphy, who was ahead of the curve in many respects on many issues, but had an interesting approach to cannabis. She wrote in her publication, The Black Candle, if the drug is indulged to any great extent, it ends in the untimely death of its addict. She was of the view that users of marijuana could turn into maniacs and were unstable, and that attitude was the prevailing attitude at that time period, and cannabis was made illegal in 1923. At that time, though, enforcement really wasn't a big issue because marijuana use was not all that common. Obviously, that changed as time passed in the 1960s. People began to consume cannabis a lot more regularly, a lot more frequently, and so enforcement attitudes changed as well. If you look at some of the data, in 1962, I believe there were 20 convictions federally in relation to cannabis. By 67, there were over 2,000, and in the early 70s, there were tens of thousands of people who'd been convicted of various cannabis-related charges. And that continued for a number of years. It really was in around 2000. There was a big case in Ontario, the Parker case, that changed things, opening up access to cannabis for medical users to a large extent. Mr. Parker was a gentleman who suffered from epileptic seizures. He grew and produced his own marijuana for his own consumption, and he was arrested, charged with various offenses under the prevailing drug laws. And the Court of Appeal for Ontario in that case decided that the prohibition, the blanket prohibition for marijuana usage or production infringed his charter rights. And so almost immediately after that case, in 2001, there were regulations passed that would allow the prescription growth of marijuana and allowed authorized growers to provide marijuana. But over the next few decades, as most of us probably recall, there was a bit of a back and forth with the governments at that time. In 2012, the government attempted to pass a bill that would impose mandatory minimum sentences on producers of marijuana. Those minimum sentences would have included up to 9 months in jail if somebody in their own home had even one plant. That bill didn't pass. But in 2013, another regulation was passed, the Marijuana for Medical Purposes regulations, that prohibited personal growth of marijuana and restricted commercial growers to only dried marijuana. And there were a few big cases. Two of them are the cases I have on this slide. One is the Smith case, where the Supreme Court of Canada concluded that restricting access to dried marijuana was unconstitutional, that there ought to be exceptions for cannabis oil as well as marijuana buds immediately. And then the following year, the federal court determined that restricting individuals to only licensed producers in terms of where they can buy their cannabis was also unconstitutional because it denied them reasonable access to their cannabis. And again, these are for individuals who had some authorization from their healthcare provider to obtain medical marijuana, which really brings us up to today. And the Cannabis Act, which I'm sure everybody is or has some level of familiarity with. It went into force in October of 2018. Generally, under that act, federally, anybody 18 years of age or older are permitted to possess up to 30 grams of dried cannabis. They can share the 30 grams of dried cannabis with other adults. It is notable that there are differences across the provinces. And so, for instance, in Ontario, you do have to be 19. But individuals can also grow up to 4 plants in their residence for personal use. And in provinces without a regulatory framework, you can buy the cannabis online. So that's the framework we have now. There are still additional restrictions, or not necessarily restrictions, but additional requirements for medicinal users. For instance, if a medicinal user wants to obtain cannabis pursuant to a prescription, they still require authorization. They still are required to register with Health Canada for their own medical purposes. They can designate another person to grow some cannabis on their behalf, but they do still have these additional requirements to go through. And the reason for that, though, is there are important distinctions between what a medicinal user can do with their cannabis compared to a recreational user. There was a lot of debate around whether or not there was a point in having medicinal users go through these additional hoops to access their cannabis around the time the Cannabis Act came out. But those changes, those laws continued. And the reason for that is in part because medicinal users can possess a lot more cannabis if they so choose. They can, if somebody's using, for instance, 5 grams per day pursuant to a prescription, they can have up to 25 plants in their home if they have medical authorization for the cannabis. A recreational user cannot. They can only have the 4 plants. A medical user can have up to 150 grams on their person at any given time. A recreational user can only have 30 grams. So there are some very important distinctions between medicinal users and recreational users. But a lot of this is also still up in the air, given that these laws, this law just came into effect. And so it still does remain to be seen how these distinctions between the recreational users and the medicinal users will play out in the future. I'm going to hand things over to Ms. Eden Dales now, who's going to be speaking about advocacy in accessing funding for cannabis.
And before we do that, I'll do a little bit of an introduction on Eden so that you understand what her perspective and where she's coming from. Eden is a master's level registered social worker, and she runs a clinic called Edendale Social Work, which provides counseling and assessments for families across Ontario. And she has extensive experience in all areas of social work, including dealing with medical marijuana issues. She commenced her career over 20 years ago and provided trauma-related services for those suffering after effects of 9/11. So we're very happy to have her with us, and looking forward to hearing her tell us a little bit about the role of the healthcare provider in obtaining medical marijuana.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you for that introduction. I will be speaking about my experience in accessing funding for medical marijuana. So as a disclaimer, I would like you to know that no funding has been provided for this presentation. Also, this is not intended to replace medical or legal advice. This talk is based on 20 years of clinical experience as a social worker, combined with a review of the evidence on this topic. This presentation is not intended for the sales of cannabis. So for today's presentation, I'm going to go through the social work role, developments and research, case review from a social work perspective, and advocacy tips and traps. So we're going to start with the role of the social worker. You will see on the PowerPoint the model for coping used for comprehensive assessment of client safety and functioning following trauma. Now more than ever, we are working with extremely limited MVA funding, especially social workers. Our intention is to offer a plan to make these limited funds work to benefit the client in the present and for ongoing services. This model, which I referred to in the last slide, is an overview of how we assess clients. This model provides a foundation to thoroughly understand how the client is functioning in all areas of their life. We can then assess and report on these areas and do a comparative model assessing both pre- and post-trauma functioning in these areas. By understanding how clients function in each of these areas, we can prepare an appropriate treatment plan based on all of the reported symptoms. Our role is to educate and work with the adjuster who is not a professional healthcare provider. We need to help them to understand the client's needs, and our recommendations need to be stated in a very clear and straightforward manner. Accessing funding, a recipe for success. So I have been successful in accessing funding for medical marijuana from both ODSP and MVA insurance. It was a combination of a comprehensive, intensive advocacy and appeal, a combination of the client's experience of reporting on the client's experience with opiates versus cannabis, and also accompanied by a prescription by a GP and any other treating healthcare professional that knows the client. The social work role in accessing funding for medical marijuana is largely based on the education and advocacy and overall partnership with the adjuster. Also, I've learned that researchers prefer to use the word cannabis instead of marijuana, as marijuana still is associated with recreational use. I prepared this model as an educational tool to identify the impact of trauma and categorize it based on 4 areas of functioning. The cannabis is intended to act as a barrier to the experience of all of these listed symptoms. If cannabis is effective, the need for multiple costly services post-trauma can be reduced and streamlined. If successful, cannabis can help promote health and well-being and improve functioning in all these 4 areas by reducing the overall impact of the symptoms in the client's life. When assessing clients, we are observers and witnesses to their experience. We are professional listeners and maintain a non-judgmental stance with no agenda, unlike other services that operate from a more behavioral model. Using this strengths-based model, we can work with the client's inherent strengths and make recommendations based on what their needs are and what they identify as being helpful or what they want to try. This leads to the overall effectiveness of treatment. As mentioned before, I was successful in accessing funding for medical marijuana. The names and details have been slightly altered for confidentiality. So this is a case of Mark, who was severely injured in a car accident. The car was demolished and he suffered chronic pain following the accident. He had expertise in growing his own marijuana prior to the accident for diagnosed anxiety. His need for pain management increased significantly following the accident. He was prescribed opiates. Upon interview with his partner, because we always use collateral interviews in our reports, his partner confirmed her plan to leave the marriage if the client continued to use opiates. She described the opiates caused a disconnected zombie-like affect in her partner. He tried a period of ketamine for chronic pain as an alternative treatment. The ketamine was extremely costly and only available in a trial phase, so it was not sustainable for long-term use. He was then left again with no options, either opiates, which would cause the marriage to dissolve, or finding a way to get cannabis covered, as he was not working after the accident. He was prescribed medical cannabis. I prepared a report with details from the interview with his partner. I was able, through intensive advocacy and appeal, to get it approved and paid for by ODSP. And I was able, through intensive advocacy, to get his motor vehicle insurance to pay for the equipment to grow his own marijuana. Moving on to advocacy. We submit reports, letters, and supporting documentation and start with a clear review of the research as a foundation for the recommendation. In keeping with our awareness of limited funding, we reduce the cost of the plan by recommending a 6-month trial period. It's baby steps. If it works, we can then request more. And when we do, we have far more evidence to support the need, using collateral interview, redoing the scales that we do in the initial report that are listed here, including the Beck Depression Inventory, the Walmer Adjustment Scales, the Impact of Events Post-Trauma Scale, and the Wong-Baker Faces Pain Scale. When we redo these scales and comment on the goals that we initiated in the previous report, we're able to show evidence of the effect of cannabis. Advocacy strategies. So we include in our report a review of the safety risks as evidenced in the research and connected to the client's details, a review of the physical, cognitive, psycho-emotional, and social functioning, the challenges experienced, and the reasons for the request for cannabis. We compare the financial and the psycho-emotional cost of opiates versus cannabis. Following the recommended 6-month trial period, there's a commitment of the treatment team to prepare progress and update reports comparing the present functioning to the initial reported findings. And we also include all relevant supporting documentation available confirming disability. The language of advocacy. We communicate clearly that we are advocating for the needs of the client and working within our scope. We are clear about our commitment to the Code of Ethics from our College of Social Workers, and we are also clear that we are acting in the client's best interest and working with what the client believes will help them feel better. There is emerging research for cannabis use in post-trauma symptoms. There's ongoing studies right now looking at cannabis use, which I'm going to review, for these post-trauma challenges. And information and resources are also going to be made available on my website and in the handouts. Evidence cannabis for concussion. Post-concussion syndrome, which is common following motor vehicle collision, causes limitations in physical, cognitive, emotional, and social functioning and quality of life. This study is examining whether the cannabis compound might help alleviate symptoms of brain injuries. Dozens of NHL players will be given CBD. Dr. Charles Tatter from UHN was quoted on the news for this study saying, "We see a lot of athletes who have chronic pain and have other problems related to repetitive brain trauma. We are reasonably optimistic that cannabis, and especially the CBD part of the cannabis, can relieve a lot of that suffering." So cannabis for the treatment of headaches. So this is a study. The relevance is that frequent and severe headaches are so common following MVC, with or without imaging to show a brain injury. Headaches can be debilitating and cause a severe impact on overall functioning in physical, cognitive, psycho-emotional, and social areas. Although the placebo-controlled clinical trials are still needed to appropriately determine the efficacy, it appears that cannabis will emerge as a potential treatment for some headache sufferers. And this is a study through the National Institute of Health. Cannabis for traumatic brain injury. This is a study relevance that TBI and symptoms of neurological changes are common following motor vehicle collision, with or without imaging. In a preclinical study, the combination of a hemp-derived cannabinoid and NMDA amino acid anesthetic is showing improved cognitive function in rodents with traumatic brain injuries compared with individual components. This project is a joint collaboration with the University of Miami School of Medicine, the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis, and the Biosciences Corporation of Toronto. This is a quote: "The results were statistically significant and encouraging." Jonathan Gilbert, who manages the University of Miami's partnership, said, "The evidence strongly suggests further testing is warranted on medical cannabis. Potential in the treatment, it's a potential for treatment in traumatic brain injury." Cannabis for treatment of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Following motor vehicle collisions, symptoms of PTSD are very debilitating and very common. We see this in almost all of our clients. This study observed the significant improvements in PTSD symptoms and quality of life. The samples Canadian PTSD patients suffer using medical cannabis for treatment. Further investigations are required to determine safety and costs to determine cannabis as appropriate treatment option for PTSD, not costs, sorry. The results of this study that were published are cannabis is a potential treatment for multiple PTSD domains, including reducing arousal and avoidance symptoms, preventing the long-term adverse effect of stress, and enhancing the extinction of blocking the reconsolidation of persistent fear memories. Cannabis for the treatment of anxiety. This is another ongoing study that I'm going to be sending out to you, so you can read a little more about it, just in the name of time. And there's also one ongoing for depression, showing that CBD oil is effective in animal model. And these are all very hopeful and positive studies so far. Finally, I'm just going to finish with the World Health Organization position on cannabis, which I think is really important. It's an evidence-based healthcare guiding organization, and they rely on the science, evidence, and research available to make recommendations. And the committee concluded, in its pure state, cannabinoid oil does not appear to have abuse potential or cause harm. As such, CBD is not currently a scheduled substance in its own right, only as a component of cannabis extracts. Current information does not justify a change to this scheduled positioning and does not justify scheduling the substance. So that's more evidence to support cannabis as a treatment for these symptoms. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate this, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Eden. Very interesting overview. Our next speaker is Dr. Tanny Raz, who is the Medical Director of Business Development at Apollo Cannabis Clinics, which is a network of medical cannabis clinics, which include specialists and physicians and healthcare practitioners that prescribe medical marijuana to clients across the country. Dr. Raz obtained her doctorate of medicine in 2012 and has been working in cannabis-related therapies since 2014. She's going to speak to us about how medical marijuana is obtained and debunking some of the myths associated with medical cannabis.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you for sharing your Thursday morning with us. Just to give you a little background on who Apollo is so that you can understand where our expertise and knowledge come from. So actually in 2013, Apollo Applied Research was born, and that's the whole purpose of it, was to be able to provide evidence to physicians and decision makers, because a lot of physicians were very uncomfortable with cannabis and they needed more information. So we wanted to understand more research so that we can help everyone understand the benefits of medical cannabis. And I can say that with the hype and interest of cannabis over the years, and proudly serving and interacting with over 50,000 patients up to date, Apollo Cannabis Clinics was born. So currently we have ongoing clinical trial studies in chronic pain, PTSD, we've completed a sleep study, and we are actually doing a driving study that is sponsored with UHN and funded by the government. So it's very exciting to see what's going to be rolling out. And of course, we have tons of other studies in the pipeline because there's so much still yet to be learned. So what exactly is the medical process? Well, if someone is interested in learning more about medical cannabis, or they'd like to be treated with medical cannabis, we encourage them to book an appointment. Now, of course, it's encouraged if you have a family physician or a specialist that can refer you, but it's not mandatory, because we do understand that not everybody has a family physician, and we also understand that not all family physicians or specialists are comfortable referring patients. So we do accept patients that are not referred as well. So when a patient is booked, we perform a full triage so we can have a better understanding of their medical history, so we can see what the medical condition composed of, what they've tried, and everything that's associated with it, so that a physician can provide a full consultation with the patient. And if they are fit for medical cannabis, then they receive a medical document, which is the terminology we use for a medical prescription in the cannabis world. Once a medical document is obtained, a patient will sit down with a medical cannabis expert and receive full education. And the education will cover everything as far as the legalities, how to take your medication, how to titrate it, what to expect, and many questions that come around it, because we do understand that for many, medical cannabis is quite new. After that, we will register a patient with a licensed producer of their choice, and that's when the medical cannabis will be shipped directly to their home or the address that they prefer. So what are the advantages of going to a clinic to obtain cannabis? Well, for starters, at Apollo Cannabis Clinics, we do provide complete free service. So everything is OHIP covered. It's no out-of-pocket fees for the patient. We do give complete education and ongoing support 7 days a week. No referral is required, but preferred. And patients can be seen in one of our many clinics, or if they are far or not close to one of our brick and mortars or out of the province, then they can still obtain an appointment through telemedicine. So some of the commonly conditions that we see are chronic pain, and of course under the chronic pain umbrella, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, neuropathic pain, rheumatoid arthritis, migraines. A lot of the other conditions that we see that are psychologically related, our psychiatrists have indicated that many patients come in for sleep disturbance, anxiety, depression, PTSD, but of course we see multiple conditions. Of course, it's encouraged to come to a physician that has medical cannabis expertise and be assessed so that they can have a better understanding to see if medical cannabis is the right choice. So with let's talk about some of the myths, because there's so many now, especially with recreational cannabis being available. One myth that I like to debunk is that many say, I don't want to try cannabis because I don't want to get high. Well, the good news is you don't have to. Just because there's THC and CBD in cannabis, it doesn't mean that you're going to feel the euphoric effect. Yes, THC is the main component that causes the euphoric effect. Good news is there are cannabis strains that have THC as little as 0.4%, indicating that you're not going to feel that euphoric effect. And that's why it's important to sit with someone who understands cannabis so they can guide you in the right strains for your condition. And if you want to indicate that, I do not want to feel a euphoric effect, they can guide you towards the strains that will not give you that effect. So another myth is, I don't want to smoke it. Well, good news is you don't have to. Cannabis can be obtained, of course, through inhalation, but we recommend vaporization because it's a safer, cleaner, better method to obtain your medication, and you do get more out of it because you're not combusting it, you're just heating it to the right temperature. A lot of patients prefer to do edibles. There are oils, there's capsules. Some patients prefer to convert it into edibles for themselves. Some prefer to use it topically. And of course, there's going to be more options coming in the near future. And another myth is, do I need to be chronically ill to try cannabis? And the answer is no. And again, that's why we encourage to come in for an assessment to understand what the medical condition is. One thing that we find is that a lot of patients have already been self-medicating. They've been using cannabis successfully and not realizing that it's the reason why it's been helping them, give them a better quality of life, either because they suffer from depression or anxiety or chronic pain. So it's better to get a full assessment to have a better understanding so that a medical cannabis expert can help you. And now that legalization is definitely rolled out, which is very exciting, another myth is, well, why do I need a prescription if I can just legally obtain it from the OCS? Well, you can if you're over the age of 19 in Ontario, but there are many reasons why we encourage medical patients to still seek cannabis from a medical source. And some of the great reasons are, well, firstly, you get the knowledge that goes with it. So you have a better understanding on why you're using the medical cannabis, how to use it, how to titrate it, and you get the ongoing support so that if it's not working for you, because it's not a one-size-fits-all treatment, an expert can definitely work with you. Other advantages, as we mentioned before, is the possession limit. If you are a medical cannabis patient, you can have up to 150 grams or the lesser amount depending on your prescription amount. Supply, I know that right now we have a supply-demand issue, but a lot of the licensed producers are trying to make sure that the supply is consistent for medical patients. Overall, it is less expensive than recreational. You do get access to different strains as far as levels of CBD and THC. It is a tax refundable if you do submit your receipts. And compassionate pricing. You can apply for compassionate pricing if you're on ODSP or different disabilities or depending on your financial income. And of course, if you're under the age of 19, and for example, if you're a child suffering from epilepsy, you can obtain it medically. So it's important to obtain medical knowledge from someone that has the background so that you can get correct treatment for medical cannabis. And at the same time, it's important to seek a clinic that will give it to you free of charge if it's OHIP covered, and physicians and specialists that have the knowledge, such as psychiatrists or pain specialists or pediatricians. And, and it's important that clinics like Apollo that have the evidence base, because we've been doing ongoing research to be able to help our patients based on the strains that and the feedback that we received and what works best. So a lot still yet to learn, but it's very exciting where we are, and it's very exciting to see how cannabis has been helping many, and we're very excited to see what's coming in the very near future. So if you want more information, there's tons on our website. Please do check it out. We're always happy to help, regardless if cannabis may or may not be the right treatment, but it's definitely an option. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Raz. Our next speaker is Stacey Stevens. Stacey is a partner at Thomson Rogers, and she devotes her entire practice to helping people with serious injuries receive full compensation. She has been at Thomson Rogers well before her call to the bar in 2005. And in addition to being an excellent lawyer and a very busy lawyer, she is sought out by local and national media to speak on a variety of issues, and having appeared on television, radio, and having articles published in the Globe and Mail. Stacey is here to talk to us today about some of the legal considerations that arise from medical marijuana. Stacey.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. What I'm hoping to do in the time that I have is sort of bring what we've heard from my co-panelists together from a legal point of view. Before I get into detail, I'm going to cover the basic principles that you need to keep in mind when you're dealing with getting funding for medical cannabis or marijuana. I'm going to touch on some concerns for healthcare providers, and again, lastly, talk about the TORP and AB funding process. So in terms of the basic principles, keep in mind, in order to get approval, there's 3 hurdles that you're going to have to overcome. You're going to need a recommendation for medical cannabis from a qualified physician, perhaps someone from Apollo. The use of the cannabis has to be related to the injuries or impairments. The test for causation is called the but-for test. And explained briefly, it's on a balance of probabilities. The injured person is going to have to establish that but for the accident, he or she wouldn't have suffered the impairments or injuries that now requires the use of the medical marijuana. If you're looking at cases where there's multiple collisions or there's perhaps a pre-existing impairment, then the applicant has a bit of a different test to meet. It's called the material contribution test, and there's cases that have come out at the LAT that talk about the fact that the applicant must establish that on more than a temporary short-term basis, his or her condition is materially worse after the accident, and that the motor vehicle accidents materially contributed to the injuries in more than a de minimis way. And lastly, the treatment that's being recommended has to be reasonable and necessary. And of course, it's subject to whatever policy limits are available on the accident benefit side. With the recognition that medical marijuana is legitimate, and of course now we have the legalization of recreational marijuana, in my view, it's opened up a number of concerns for healthcare providers. And as much as we want to advocate on behalf of our clients to ensure that they're getting the best possible treatment out there, there's concerns, I think, for the healthcare providers as well. First of all, consent. Now, and these are questions you're going to have to ask yourself. You might want to consult with your college. I know the College for Massage Therapists has a specific policy. But can a client who has smoked marijuana give consent to treatment? Are they able to understand the risks and the benefits that are associated with the treatment that you're now providing? And are they able to respond appropriately to any questions that you have? And this concern, I think, would be more related to someone who is a recreational marijuana user as opposed to someone who's using medical marijuana. And like I said, when in doubt, just check with your college and make sure that they don't have a policy on this. And also consider whether or not the use of the recreational marijuana is going to alter your client's mental or physical abilities. If you're dealing with a chronic pain client, is the use of recreational marijuana going to minimize their ability to feel pain, pressure points, or tolerate or recover from the treatment? And of course, if you're dealing with someone who has a brain injury, there's issues with respect to substance abuse and whether or not that's going to limit the recovery. Is it going to worsen their issues with balance, for example, or speech problems? Is it going to increase their disinhibition or their dysregulation? Will it have a more potent effect because of the brain injury? Is it going to enhance their cognitive impairments or perhaps create a greater risk of depression? And of course, we all know that if your client has a pre-existing substance abuse problem, whether it's drug-induced, whether it's alcohol-based, adding or increasing recreational marijuana on top of that may have negative impacts. How many of you will drive your clients somewhere? And how many of your clients are going to be possessing marijuana when you drive with them. The Cannabis Smoke-Free Ontario and Road Safety Act prohibits a person from driving with marijuana in the car unless it's packed in baggage that's fastened, closed, or is not otherwise readily available to any person in the car. And that doesn't matter if it's medical marijuana or if it's recreational. So if you're an occupational therapist, for example, and you're out driving with your client and they've got marijuana and it's in their pocket, it's in their cigarette package, and God knows for some reason you get pulled over and this gets called into question, you're the one as the driver who could actually be facing the charges. How does the legalization of marijuana change how we treat medical marijuana? In my view, it doesn't. If you have a client who has or is using recreational marijuana, and now they come to you and they say, look, I'm buying it from whichever licensed retailer is out there, and I want my AB insurer to pay for it, they're likely not going to pay for it unless you've got the medical document that supports it. And in that situation, I would always highly recommend that the clients are referred to somebody like Apollo to get that proper documentation in place, so then we can get it sent to the AB insurer and use that to get funding. And I did some research before today, and I didn't come up with any cases where the insurer has agreed to pay for recreational marijuana. When we're talking about legitimizing it for an AB claim or a tort claim, as I mentioned before, we've got the but-for or the material contribution test with respect to causation that applies on both claims. As well, it has to be reasonable and necessary. But regardless of whether we're talking about medical marijuana, we're talking about the need for attendant care, OT services, social work, the golden rule is always going to be make sure you document the reasons why the marijuana is needed and what are the benefits of same. And don't be afraid to rely on collateral evidence from family members. Of course, you've got your client's own evidence and the medical literature. We've heard from Eden that there are studies that are in the works, and of course we've heard from Tanny, with respect to the research that their company has been doing. So there's a wealth of information out there that you're going to be able to include in your reports to advocate on behalf of your clients to get this approved. And when we're looking at it from the tort perspective, and when I say the tort claim, for those of you who are not familiar, if there is an at-fault driver, the injured party has a claim against the at-fault driver in tort. And we know that the cost of medical marijuana, especially for a young person, over their lifetime can be very, very expensive. So in that situation, the life care planner is going to have to include this in the future care report. But hopefully by this time, there is a license in place. You've got that medical document in hand. There's a documented history showing the benefit of the medication over other recommended narcotic medications or other pharmaceuticals. Without that information, without that track history in your future care report, it's going to make it very difficult for lawyers to get compensation for that type of an expense in the future. Kevin?
Thank you very much, Stacey, for that excellent overview. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and get into the question and answer phase of the webinar, and please keep your questions coming. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can. One question that arose that I can answer right away, actually, is a question about the slides that some of our presenters have used, and they will be sent out to participants in the webinar in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So you will have copies of those, which you can keep for your reference. Now, there are a lot of questions that have come in. So like I said, we'll try to answer them all, but in the event we don't, we will be sending out an email in the next few days answering those questions. Dr. Raz, one question that's come in is, now that recreational cannabis is legal, why would you need a medical license or medical cannabis?
So as I mentioned, it's important if you're medically seeking cannabis to understand if your condition is the right condition for medical cannabis. And because cannabis is not a one-size-fits-all type of treatment, you need the expertise to help you with obtaining the right strains, how to take your medication, so dosing, titration. You need the ongoing care and support so that an expert, a physician, can work with you to make sure that medical cannabis can potentially help you and give you the benefits that you're looking for.
Thank you. Stacey, when a client has been smoking recreational marijuana before an accident and now is smoking more after an accident, how do you go about legitimizing a claim for medical marijuana from an accident benefit insurer?
There's a couple of things that we want to do in that situation. First of all, as we go back to the basic advice that I think you've heard from pretty much everyone at the table, which is get your client referred to the proper facility that can prescribe and give you that medical document that your client's going to need. What you don't want to face is an adjuster or an adjudicator at the LAT who's then going to turn around and say, well, your client was smoking X number, X number of grams or X number of joints before the accident, and I don't really see any difference in the consumption. You're just trying to get me to pay for something he or she's already been using. So you need to be able to document the differences. Why does the client need to switch from, the recreational strain, which, as we've heard, has had the THC and the CBD, to one that has more of a CBD strain? Is there a change in symptoms? Is there a change in the pain levels, their sleep patterns? All of this, we'll just call it general sort of collateral information, is going to be very, very important in order to establish why the need has changed from pre to post accident.
And just a follow-up question to that, does a treatment provider need to submit an OCF 18 for medical marijuana?
No, you don't. There's legislation, section 38(2), sub C of the SABS, that says that the insurer is not liable to pay for an incurred medical benefit before an OCF 18 is submitted, unless it's drugs prescribed by a regulated health professional, which again brings us back to the medical documents that's needed and getting the proper license for medical marijuana. And I know Eden had mentioned the equipment for growing at home, and I didn't find any cases directly speaking to this, but I would think that if you are dealing with someone who wants to purchase the equipment to grow at home, then you would likely need to put in the OCF 18 for that.
Michael, you've mentioned the current landscape in terms of the legal landscape of medical marijuana. Are there any other changes that are coming or anticipated changes that might be coming down the pipeline?
I think the honest answer is I don't know yet. These changes happened relatively recently. I think an open question is whether or not in the province we'll have open consumption venues. I think there was some concern that prior to legalization that Canada would be the new Amsterdam and there'd be coffee shops everywhere. That hasn't happened, and it's not permissible yet. I think there are a lot of companies that are looking to that, and perhaps that's something we do see. I do know that Second Cup has applied for a federal license, so maybe that's a change that we do see.
Okay. Eden, can you tell me how a social worker can help someone in a chronic pain type situation as it relates to medical marijuana?
Sure. So when somebody has chronic pain, we see the kind of umbrella effect where it affects every part of their functioning. It affects their mood, it affects their physical functioning, it affects their cognitive functioning and their relationships. So when you look at chronic pain, I think it's like you have to kind of look at the compounding layers. You've got the trauma, you've got the pain, then you've got the experience of the pain, the feelings about the pain. And so really getting to understand clients who have chronic pain on a deep level where you can observe how they, like their pace and their thought process and their response to treatment, then you can really provide a detailed report so the adjuster can kind of understand how the chronic pain affects them in every area of their life and doesn't just think of it as, oh, you have chronic pain in your leg because you had a leg injury. Well, you know, that's your problem, because the problem becomes in every part of their functioning. So if they have chronic pain and we're working with the hopelessness around how they respond to the pain, and the treatments that they've been prescribed haven't worked, and somebody recommends that they try cannabis, then that would be the approach that we would prepare a report to really help them to understand why this new treatment is needed, especially if the client believes in the treatment and wants to try the treatment. I hope that's helpful.
Great. And Dr. Raz, a question's come in about when there isn't support from the family physician for medical cannabis and the patient or the client wants to use it. Has Apollo come across this situation before, and how is that dealt with?
Many times, and that's why we don't expect you to have a referral to be seen by one of our physicians, because we do understand that not everybody has a family doctor, and we do also understand that not all family doctors feel comfortable referring. So regardless, we will still successfully see a patient and assess to see if medical cannabis is the right treatment for them.
And are you aware of any resources that we could perhaps point our clients' family physicians to educate them on the benefits of medical cannabis?
So yeah, so one good starter is our website, actually, because we do have a lot of resources, as not only our research, but just a lot of everything that's going on a daily basis, because we do understand that this sector is quite fast-paced. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot rolling out every day. So that's one. Other resources is going on licensed producers' websites. They also offer a lot of knowledge and information, so that's a good start.
Stacey, has there been any developments in terms of the License Appeal Tribunal and medical cannabis at this point?
From what I've seen in all of my research, the decisions have been very positive. There is a lot of the adjudicators are now recognizing that this is a legitimate medical, I don't want to say device, but treatment. And as long as you've got the paperwork and the support that you need in your reports, I think your chances of getting the LAT to order payment are better than they were before.
Excellent. Good to have some good news coming out of the LAT for once. Michael, what other insurance coverage might be available for patients that are in need of medical marijuana?
Well, probably not drug plans, because medical marijuana does not have a drug identification number, and so generally it's not something that can be claimed. There are group benefit plans that have come out. Sun Life is offering one, Manulife is offering another. Generally, they'll provide coverage, from what I've seen, up to a few $1,000s annually, which for many people is nowhere close to enough, but it is some coverage that's available. I think we'll probably see more of those plans being offered in the future, but that's kind of what's out there currently.
Thank you. Dr. Raz, you'd mentioned a little bit about the cost of medical marijuana being less expensive than recreational marijuana in the same amounts. Can you give us an idea? I know it's likely strain dependent, but an idea of the cost comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. So one reason why I find it's more cost effective going medically is because when you have a better understanding of what you need and what strains may benefit you, then you're not doing a trial and error and testing out multiple strains and paying a lot of money just to do that. At the same time, when you understand what you need as far as titration, you take the amount that's required and then you gradually you work low and slow slow and work your way up. So right there, you're saving a lot. And then when you're working with a professional and they understand, for example, that you have financial restrictions or you are on ODSP or any type of disability, then we will help find the right producers that will offer you the discounts that go with it. So medical cannabis can range, I've seen anywhere from $4 a gram, and it can go up to $120 per bottle for oil. Of course, that's just a very rough range. There's multiple strains, multiple LPs that offer a lot of fair prices. And that's why it's important to work with someone that knows the industry and understands it so they can help you obtain the cannabis at a fair price that works for you and your budget.
Eden, how successful have you or other social workers in your practice been in getting approval for medical cannabis treatment plans?
So there haven't been many. I mean, they're just starting to listen to the needs. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, so I find that I've applied for almost everything, and when I've had success, I take note of what worked. So when they let me guide them and help them, the advocacy works, and we don't give up. We really join with the adjuster, as I said before, in a partnership. We anticipate questions and concerns that they'll have based on previous experiences with submitting plans, and we include that in our letter ahead of time to try and address anything, so there leaves very little room for them to challenge it. And I find that, when I believe in what I'm selling and I believe in something that I think is reasonable and necessary, and the client believes in it, the advocacy comes very naturally. And using the details and the comprehensive assessment and helping the adjuster to connect on a human level and understand really how their life is impacted by their pain, by the symptoms, looking at all the evils available, opiates, no treatment, unaffordable treatments, and everything available. This seems to be the best option. And when we are able to share with them that they're going to be paying for some kind of treatment, and this is recommended by a physician, and show them cases where it was approved, we are more successful. So as I said before, I've only had maybe 1 or 2 clients approved for marijuana on a treatment plan, which I now know I don't need to submit a treatment plan for. But, I almost, maybe more than half of our clients are using cannabis, and I'm looking forward to advocating to work with the adjuster to try and get them approved, because I think it is a far better treatment option for them. So I hope that's helpful.
Dr. Raz, obviously we've talked a lot today about getting medical marijuana funded and when it is appropriate for a patient or a client to be using it. Are there situations where you wouldn't recommend medical cannabis or particular medical conditions that you would suggest that the client potentially avoid?
So of course, that could be the case. And that's why it's important to do a full medical history to understand what medications have been tried or the patient is currently taking, to see if there's any interactions. And to see, basically if there's ever been any types of, for example, allergies in the past, et cetera. So it's really case by case. It's important to get a full assessment to be able to fairly judge if medical cannabis is right for you or not. So I can't say there's anything specific that will completely disqualify you. It's definitely a full medical history and assessment is required to be able to obtain that.
Okay. Michael, how has the legalization of recreational marijuana impacted medical users?
I think to some extent the jury's still out on that. These changes just happened. And I think in theory, one thing that is supposed to happen is because there are more federally licensed producers, there's more competition, so the price of cannabis should go down. I don't know if on the ground, perhaps Dr. Raz has seen that happen. But that's something that I think people are expecting to happen. Whether or not that also provides medicinal users with greater access to a variety of strains, provided they have the recommendation of their healthcare provider. I'm not sure. I think that's something that everyone's hoping to see. Dr. Raz might be able to comment upon what you've seen at your clinic on the ground in terms of any changes since legalization. But I think from a high-level approach, more competition, hopefully a reduction in price, remains to be seen whether that's happening.
Well, to add to that, one thing we've noticed is more people are comfortable now asking about medical cannabis and if it's the right treatment for them. So I find that it's definitely broken down the barriers as far as where the stigma is concerned. As far as pricing or availability, we're finding that we're getting more consistent supply. So that's definitely a positive, because when your condition is dependent on it, and when it's helping your quality of life, it's something you definitely want to be able to obtain all the time. And pricing, well, medically, it's really easy for us to be able to guide patients to obtain cannabis at a price point that works for them. And again, we also advocate. So if we can help a patient in any way, we'll definitely do that to make sure that they can still get their medication.
And I think this is an issue you might have covered in your talk about the different strains that are available, but one question that's come in is that one concern clients in this person's experience have is that cannabis is known for increasing appetite, and clients are concerned about gaining weight if they are on medical cannabis, and particularly if they're unable to exercise. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So not all strains will increase your appetite. Just like medication, some will have certain side effects and some won't. So that, again, we can help make sure that you obtain a strain that's not going to cause that effect. So no, if that's the fear of preventing you from trying cannabis, I can confidently say that that's not the case with all the medical strains out there.
And Stacey, this is a sort of a logistical question. Once a client has a prescription for medical marijuana, but the insurer is unwilling to pay it up front, and they don't have any money to pay for that prescription on their own independently, is it possible for a client to, say, put it on their credit card and then seek reimbursement for that from the insurer?
The client, yes, can use their own credit card and then submit it to the insurer for reimbursement. Because the insurer has 30 days to pay, I would strongly recommend that don't just send in an OCF-6 without the groundwork first being laid, whether it's in reports that there's a need for this, or pick up the phone and give the adjuster a call to let them know that this is coming. I had a call recently, or a discussion recently, with an occupational therapist who had been reported to her college because what she was doing was purchasing the client's medical marijuana on her credit card and then giving it to the client, and then she was submitting, or the client was then submitting the OCF-6, or the company was submitting the OCF-6 for reimbursement on behalf of the client. From what I understand in my follow-up conversation, that the college has investigated the issue and has said, okay, fine, we don't think that you're doing anything wrong. But I did a bit of research. Section 6 of the Cannabis Smoke-Free Ontario and Road Safety Statute specifically prohibits anyone from distributing marijuana that's been sold by anyone other than an Ontario cannabis retailer. And the Act defines distributing as delivering or making marijuana available in any manner to another person. So if you are a registered health professional and you are thinking that you're helping your client by being generous in paying for this and then submitting it for reimbursement, you better be careful, because the Act does strictly prohibit it, and the fine under the Act for the first offense is $100,000 for the person and $250,000 for the corporation.
Wow, those are some steep fines. Dr. Raz, why would a patient choose to go to Apollo for medical marijuana instead of getting it from their family doctor if they have a supportive family doctor?
Well, one main reason is not many family doctors or many physicians out there don't have the knowledge associated with how to guide their patients with obtaining it, titrating it, dosing it, et cetera, with medical cannabis. So it's important to go to a clinic like Apollo Cannabis Clinics, because you get the experts that understand it, that have been working with patients, and in our case, 50,000 patient interactions so that we're able to guide you appropriately. So, and if you are referred, we do send referring notes back to your referring physician so that they can follow your treatment with us.
Another question that I think you would be best suited to answer is, can medical cannabis or strains of it be used while someone is pregnant or nursing?
We advise against it. There hasn't been enough research to be able to safely say that yes, so we advise against it.
Eden, how, when a client is receiving sort of a multidisciplinary treatment plan or treatment modality, how can we tease out the sort of efficacy of medical marijuana as opposed to, the other treatments that the client might be receiving?
So I think when there's so many people involved in the client's care, it can be very overwhelming for the client. And I see that, you really have to understand a client's pace and their personality and their internal inherent coping skills in order to understand their response to all these treatments. So if you have all these people asking them to do all this different homework and no one's really thinking about what others are asking of them, it can be very overwhelming. So when you're looking at like another treatment, like looking at cannabis, the idea is that, like I said in my presentation, it's intended to provide a barrier to all of the symptoms that are being addressed by all the treating providers. So somebody's there for communication and cognitive, somebody's there for physical and, physical functioning, somebody's there for emotional functioning. So if there's a barrier to all of those symptoms, like an umbrella effect, then I think that all the providers would recognize the goals are starting to be met and they're starting to achieve more. And the only way to look at the efficacy of it would be to, maybe the team collaborates to decide, okay, we're all going to evaluate over the next 3 or 6 months, and let's all pick 3 goals that we want to see if they get any better, and then meeting again or updating the report on those set goals. That would be a way to see if it is helping in all of the areas that it's intended to. I think that's the best way that I would describe looking at the efficacy. Things should get better. I remember at a back to school conference, I think it was last year, there was Dr. Kahane spoke, and he's the head of addictions, I believe, at Women's College. I'm not sure, but I remember him saying that, it has to be recommended after all other treatment options have been exhausted, but also it has to help with functioning. Like there has to be an effect where you continue to use the cannabis because the client starts to function better and do more in all of the different areas. Like all treatments, I would imagine, but that would be the goal and the way to look at it. So I think every treating professional would be able to see if the cannabis is helping them meet those goals.
Dr. Raz, is there any concern, and this might be a myth that simply needs some debunking, that medical marijuana could act as a sort of a gateway drug to stronger drugs of some sort or something of that nature?
So we've been actually finding the opposite. We've been finding in our research and just by our patient interaction, it's causing a substitution effect. A lot of our patients are reporting that ever since they've started using medical cannabis, their need and desire for other substances such as alcohol or opiate use has decreased. So personally, from our observation, we've been finding that it's been doing the opposite effects, and that's encouraging.
Okay. Stacey and Michael, I suppose this would be a question for you. When you're preparing a tort case and you're looking at a future care report, for example, where medical marijuana is prescribed or suggested, what do you like to see in terms of the contents of that future care report, in terms of the proposed plan for medical marijuana? Would you prefer to see a range or simply a referral to a clinic like Apollo in terms of the future care needs?
I think, from my point of view, If it's something that's new, that's being introduced, I would prefer to have the referral to Apollo or another company already been done. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier, which is that the golden rule is to make sure that everything that is being recommended is documented and is medically supported. And that's very, very important, especially when we're talking about future care reports, because in those cases, you've got your life care planner who's making these recommendations. If we get a report that doesn't have medical support behind it, we will send that report to the client's family doctor, to their physiatrist, to whatever medical specialist that we think is needed in order to support that life care planner's recommendations. And that's not to say that we're feeling that the life care planner is simply not qualified to make the recommendations. It's just we know from previous cases that the courts have been very critical of life care plans that go in without medical support behind them.
Dr. Raz, when it comes to future care reports, one of the questions that's come in has dealing with, how much should I budget per month, or how much should I expect for a cost of medical marijuana into the future? What resources are available to life care planners to try to find kind of the cost that one might need to provide appropriate support and information within one of their life care reports?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of other cannabis clinics, but at Apollo, we'll do all that. We'll actually provide all that information so that it's all mapped out for the next 3 months, 6 months, and for the lifetime of the patient. So depending on what the physician has prescribed and what condition the patient has and how they're using their medication, how successful they are, we help map all that out.
And I think this is something that you covered in your talk a little bit, that you've started some really exciting and interesting research with respect to medical marijuana and driving. And are there any guidelines currently available, or is you're sort of on the cutting edge of that research?
So the study is it's ongoing. It's actually quite exciting because we're working with UHN and it's government funded. So there's definitely lots to be learned and rolled out. But as far as driving is concerned, it's just like any other narcotics. We advise against driving under the influence.
And are there strains perhaps that don't result in impairment, or is that generally across the board, if medical marijuana is being used, you shouldn't be operating a vehicle?
So it's that's a sticky topic, because yes, there's lots of strains that will not cause any impairment. And I took my cannabis this morning and I'm here functioning and doing my webinar, but just for safety reasons, we have to say, because we don't know what lifestyle, we don't know all the details and what the daily life of a patient is. So it's better to say that better not to drive under the influence.
And Michael and Stacey, there's another question with respect to the use of medical marijuana and implications for clients that continue to work. Have there been any legal implications that you're aware of at this point in terms of clients and their ability to work when using medical marijuana?
I'm not aware of any cases addressing that issue. I would expect that it might be in part a question for employment lawyers, but it would probably depend as well on the THC content in that strain. I mean, if there's a large psychoactive component to any of the cannabis that's being ingested, well, that might have an impact on work. But I haven't seen a case actually dealing with that.
No, I haven't either. And I know, for example, at our workplace, we've developed policies with respect to the use of medical marijuana. So if you do have a client who's looking to go back to work or has returned to work and they've got, again, the appropriate paperwork in place, a conversation with the employer prior to starting the return to work program could benefit your client. At least then that way, the employer is not going to be surprised to learn down the road that your client is using medical marijuana, and hopefully not terminate them or cause any other issues for them.
And I suppose the other potential would be that in the event that medical marijuana is the only useful treatment and it does result in impairment that results in client being unable to work, you would seek compensation either from the accident benefit insurer for income replacement benefits or in a tort claim for income loss.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Eden, can you tell us a little bit about your interactions with ODSP and having funding for medical marijuana approved?
So this was a number of years ago, but I worked very closely with ODSP, and they were aware that the client was growing marijuana prior, and it was initially denied, and I worked alongside the lawyer, and we advocated very, very strongly, and we were successful in getting it approved. So they approved I think it was the plant, and then, but not the equipment, and that had to go through the motor vehicle insurance.
Now, has anyone on the panel, and this is sort of an open-ended question that I think that, there's going to be a lot of information about medical marijuana out there, but in terms of traveling with cannabinoid oil, for example, is there any issues related to that? And how can one with medical marijuana, a valid prescription in Canada, potentially travel with that prescription?
Unfortunately, you cannot travel outside of Canada with cannabis, regardless medically or not. Within Canada, you can freely travel anywhere. So,
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I mean, there are some states where marijuana is legalized, but federally it's illegal in the United States, and so you can't cross the border with it. So we strongly advise against it.
Now, have any of you had any experience working with residential clients that are in residential homes, for example, that require medical cannabis? And is there any training available to frontline staff in terms of the administration of medical cannabis to those patients?
we are actually currently doing that. So I guess it's based on the clinic, but yes, we are supporting and we are working alongside with the facilities to ensure that we meet all their guidelines and vice versa, and we're able to help patients.
Okay. So it appears that we're running out of time here in terms of the question and answer period. There are some very specific questions that have been asked that we will get to by way of email. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. The next major PIA-related event is the Back to School Conference that's being held in Toronto in September. I'd encourage all of you to check out the PIA Law website for registration details and dates, and I believe that will also be available in a webinar format. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists for their time and the interesting discussion this morning, and thank all of you for joining us.